of appeals he's made to international leaders to support Ukraine against Russia's invasion, including a speech to the U.S. Congress yesterday. While we're waiting for that speech to begin, we have our full team coverage with us here in our studios, our chief international editor, Richard Walker. And in the Bundestag for us, we have Michaela Küfner, our chief political editor. Good to have you both. Michaela, I want to start with you as we're looking just to see when Volodymyr Zelenskyy starts speaking. The German government and lawmakers, I imagine that they are really eagerly awaiting this speech.
Yes, absolutely. And what they're expecting is to hear an emotional appeal, as they've heard many times before. Germany has been eager to stress that financially it is the biggest supporter of Ukraine. MPs here have increasingly felt also touched by Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who really gained in profile, becoming a true leader of his nation throughout these past couple of weeks. And notably, both sides appear to have become more realistic in their expectations of each other. With Ukraine still expecting NATO, expecting Germany to deliver more weapons, yes, to deliver also more money to bolster an economy under attack. But at the same time, there's no longer an expectation of a timeline towards NATO, which clearly is off the table also in Kiev right now.
But do you think there might also be some trepidation on the part of German lawmakers that, Germany has faced criticism for not doing more?
Absolutely, and clearly the Ukrainian ambassador here keeps calling on Germany to simply do more. Ideally, they would want to see fighter jets, something that Poland, for instance, has offered, but only, and this has been stressed time and time again by President Morawiecki, Prime Minister there, that it would only be under the umbrella of NATO and the United States. So even those countries who would like to deliver much more directly, being cautious when it comes to having direct contact, to eventually potentially being seen as working together with the Ukrainian military. And this is a red line also for Germany, also for the United States, where Germany remains very firm indeed that that contact must not take place. There must not be any kind of claim made by Moscow that a NATO country would take part in that war. And this is where Germany still stands very firmly, having, and I must remind us all, because a week feels like a year at this point in time, after it took German Chancellor Olaf Scholz only 48 hours after the Russian attack to move from no, we will not deliver any weapons, to declaring that those first deliveries, surface-to-air rocket-propelled grenades, would be sent.
We've just been looking at pictures here from the Bundestag Live and seen Olaf Scholz speaking there to the head of his party. We also saw the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, just now. Richard, coming to you now, this address to the German parliament, it comes just a day after Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed the U.S. Congress. What did you make of that speech?
Yeah, it was extraordinary. This is just the latest in a series of these kinds of addresses that Zelenskyy has been doing to national parliaments in various key countries. He's also spoken to the British Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, and of course the US Congress being the most important audience really of all for him. And I think what comes across, aside from any of the specific messages, is just what a good communicator he is.
That right there, yeah. We're just listening to one of the vice presidents of the Bundestag, that's Katrin Göring-Eckardt of the Green Party. We should note that the president of the Bundestag, Bärbel Bas, is ill at the moment. We are just going to look at these pictures as she's introducing Volodymyr Zelenskyy. But Richard, do continue.
Yeah, I mean, and so he had a tailored message really for his audience, invoking Pearl Harbor, 9/11.
Okay, there is the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Andriy Milnek, standing. And I think that video link, Richard, sorry to cut you off, I do see it's up now. Yeah. We see Zelenskyy there on the video getting a standing ovation.
Es ist uns eine Ehre, dass Sie heute zu uns sprechen werden. Auf der Tribüne begrüße ich auch und von Herzen Botschafter Andriy Melnik, schön, dass Sie erneut bei uns sind. Seit Jahren ist Krieg. Die Krim, der Donbass wurden überfallen und der neue, eiskalte, brutale Angriff auf die Ukraine, auf die Freiheit, auf die Demokratie schafft ein Leid, dessen Ausmaß wir hier nur erahnen können. Seit 3 Wochen leisten die Menschen in der Ukraine mit allen Kräften Widerstand
Kathleen Gilling echoed
gegen
their
Putins
speaking.
Angriffskrieg.
And she's talking, she introduced, first of all, the President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and then welcomed again the Ukrainian ambassador, Andriy Melnik. She is now speaking here about what has been witnessed these first few weeks. And we see really the warm applause there from the Bundestag.
And I think, what we just saw there, the standing ovation, was absolutely reminiscent of what we saw in the US Congress yesterday, the same warmth of reception.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me yesterday when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, introduced Volodymyr Zelenskyy was she did so with the cry "Slava Ukraini," glory to Ukraine. So taking on one of the slogans that the Ukrainians themselves have had in this war, the rallying cries that Zelenskyy has, taking on herself. So I think that kind of shows the kind of the power of the communication that Zelenskyy has achieved. So I'm really curious to see what he says in this speech now. And what we saw in his speech to Congress yesterday was his ability to make a connection with that audience, talking about things like Pearl Harbor, talking about 9/11, saying, remember the morning of Pearl Harbor when your sky was black from the planes attacking you, and trying to draw a visceral connection between the people there and what's happening in Ukraine now. So I think it would be very interesting to see what kind of a message that he has that chimes in with Germany's own experience, with Germany's historical experience.
He even invoked Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream in English in that speech. And you're right, Richard, he really has become such an important communicator to parliaments around the world. You mentioned he spoke at the Canadian Parliament as well, to the Canadian Parliament. What has his main message been? Asking for more help, asking for a no-fly zone?
Yeah, so, well, he's had a kind of a combination of messages. The emotional message to try to really sort of embed in the hearts of these lawmakers, these influential people in these countries, that an identification with what is happening in Ukraine. But also he has concrete requests. As you mentioned, one of the messages has been close the skies over Ukraine, try to prevent Russia from being able to bombard Ukrainian cities in the way that they have been doing. And so the Ukrainians have been requesting that NATO enforce a so-called no-fly zone over Ukraine. But NATO has absolutely balked at this because, of course, enforcing any kind of no-fly zone would mean that NATO aircraft would have to potentially engage with Russian aircraft over that sky. And as we just heard from Michaela, NATO is absolutely determined that this war that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine should not become a war between Russia and NATO, because that has the potential for nuclear escalation. That could become something absolutely even more devastating than what we're seeing now. But what was quite interesting to see is that Zelensky's communications does have an impact. If he's not getting everything he wants, still just hours later, Joe Biden announced a further $800 million worth of military aid for Ukraine, including some pretty significant things. 800 Stinger missiles. These are portable missile systems, the kind of systems that can have a real impact on the battlefield. And also, interestingly, as far as we know, for the first time, providing some drones, or specifically what are called loitering munitions. These are self-flying aircraft, unmanned aircraft, which destroy targets by flying into them. So we're hearing that they've provided a number of Switchblade drones, they're called. So this is an interesting further step, and that's the largest individual package of military aid so far. So, and Olaf Scholz just last night at a press conference where I was asking him about this new package of US aid. He confirmed that Germany would continue providing military support to Ukraine, that it's made its decision and that it will continue doing that. So it'll be interesting to see whether there are any further announcements from the German side. The signal from Germany has been a bit more they don't want to talk too much in specifics about what they want to supply.
And Zelenskyy does now have the word. Let's listen in.
Thank you. Madam President,
Sehr geehrter Herr Bundeskanzler Scholz, liebe Damen und Herren Abgeordnete und Journalisten, die auch anwesend sind.
Шановний німецький народе, звертаюсь до вас після 3 тижнів повномасштабного вторгнення російських військ в Україну. Після 8 років війни
following the
на сході моєї
8
держави,
years of the war on the east of my country, Donbass, I'm addressing you when Russia is shelling our cities,
в Україні.
ruining, destroying everything, whatever we have in Ukraine. Wonderful buildings, hospitals, schools, churches, using missiles, air bombs, reactive artillery missiles. Over the last 3 weeks, there's been a huge loss of human life. We're talking about the order of thousands of Ukrainians, 108 children of them, in the middle of Europe here in the 21st century.
Я звертаюсь до вас
I'm
після
addressing to you following a number of negotiations, meetings, and requests for support, that some of those requests have been too late following the sanctions, which do not seem to be sufficient in order to bring the war to an end. And having seen much connections, your economy has been losing with Russia. In order to stop funding the war, I feel grateful. And at the same time, we continue feeling what not all of you are noticing. And again, you seem to be protecting behind a wall. We are talking about this concerning trend with every new bomb falling on our earth and our Ukraine. You cannot sit back without supporting. When did it happen in terms of these events? Distinguished politicians, German nation, I'm addressing to you. We have been telling you that some large-scale preparations were taking place for a large-scale war. We have been asking you what Ukraine had to do in order to join NATO, and every time we kept hearing no answer. At this point in time, we have been told that was impossible. Now, Ukraine's accession to the European Union is another issue to be discussed. I understand to what extent this is politics, but at the same time, this is a cornerstone, a building block for a new wall. We have been asking Europe to impose preventive sanctions. We have been asking you, ladies and gentlemen of the German Bundestag, and we felt all those delays. We saw your reluctance to impose sanctions. We understood, we could see your willingness to continue doing business with Russia. Now, all of a sudden, we're in the middle of this cruel war. And again, this is something that you fail to see. You're still protecting yourselves behind a wall that does not make it possible for you to see what we are going through. I'm addressing you in the name of Ukrainians.
Тож я звернусь до вас від Маріуполя. Ми російські війська заблокували і просто
Russian troops are blocking
просто знищують все, що там є. Все. І всіх, хто там є. Сотні тисяч людей.
thousands of men and women and children are being attacked 24/7, deprived of water, of electric power, of connections, and Russian troops do not distinguish between civilians and military objects. They use anything as targets.
Сотні людей, який був підірваний вчора.
Thousands of
Дитячі лікарні. Житлові райони
objects were destroyed yesterday, including kindergartens and hospitals and schools. This is not about military objects only. Also, no humanitarian load is allowed by them. Not a single shelling has ever stopped in order to let humanitarian aid reach our civilians.
Якщо згадаєте, що наче для вас Берлінський повітряний міст, який можна було зробити, тому що небо було безпечним, з неба вас не вбивало. Як зараз у нашій країні, коли ми не можемо зробити навіть повітряний міст, коли небо дає хіба що російські ракети та авіабомби. Я звертаюся до вас від імені українців старшого віку, багатьох тих, хто пережив Другу світову війну, хто врятувався під час окупації і 70 років назад, хто пережив Бабин Яр, куди в минулому році приїжджав президент Штайнмаєр. Я був йому вдячний на десятиліття трагедії, і куди зараз ударили російські ракети. Саме в це місце бивша родина, яка пішла в Бабин Яр. Вбивши знову через 80 років. Я звертаюся до вас від усіх, хто чув, як щороку політики кажуть «ніколи знову». То побачивши слова, нічого не варто. Бо знову в Європі намагаються знищити цілий народ, знищити все завдяки чому ми живемо, ради чого. Я звертаюся до вас від імені наших військових, тих, хто захищає нашу державу, а отже й цінності, про які часто говорять всюди в Європі, всюди і у вас. Свободу і рівність, можливість жити вільно і підкорятись іншій державі, яка вважає чужу землю своїм життєвим простором. Захищається це без вашого лідерства, без вашої сили. Чому держави за океаном?
All right, we are having a little bit of trouble there with our translation. We apologize for that. We're going to try to get that up and running as President Zelenskyy is, of course, still speaking. Richard, let's talk first of all about what we've heard so far, because I did find it quite interesting what President Zelenskyy was saying about Germany protecting itself still behind a wall.
Yeah, so I think if we compare what we've heard so far, and of course it's very disappointing we've lost the translation, we'll see if we can get that back to that speech as quickly as we possibly can. Yeah, the tone so far has been quite critical. Pointing out, for example, the sanctions that are in place have not been enough to end the war. Talking about Ukraine's long-running desire to join NATO, that we kept telling you that we wanted to join NATO, we kept asking to do that, and we kept hearing no answer. This sort of feeling, which I think we've heard also from Volodymyr Zelenskyy before, that Ukraine has been strung along by NATO, that what Ukraine interpreted as a promise back in 2008 that it could join NATO has never really got anywhere. And saying that he has the sense that Germany is failing to see, the people are failing to see what Ukraine is going through now as well. So I think, quite a strong message, which chimes in with some of the messaging we have been hearing from him. It hasn't just been open arms outreach. There's been a kind of really a strong message of step up and support us, that we are the front line now of a war against a major aggressor that is also potentially a threat to the rest of Europe and to NATO. And that it needs all of the support that it can possibly get.
OK, I'm just hearing that our translation is back up and running. Apologies again for that. Let's see if we can listen back into President Zelenskyy.
8 years following the destroyed Sumy, Chernigov, Donbas, for the second time, following 8 years after the Second World War, where thousands and millions of people were tortured, all of a sudden we're in the middle of a new war. Looks like still even not every guilt was redeemed following the 8 years. Now, looks like Europe is hiding behind a new wall that is being built up. So I'm addressing you. Let me remind you of what we need. Europe is not going to survive, is not going to keep its values. A former comedian, actor, and then President of the US, Ronald Reagan, once said in Berlin, "Mr. President, tear down this wall." Now, let me tell you again, Chancellor Scholz, please take down this wall. Give Germany the role of leadership that you deserve, and your future generations will be proud of. Please support us. Support peace. Please support each and every Ukrainian. Stop the war. Help us. Help us stop the war. Glory to Ukraine.
Дуже дякую.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
OK, that was the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressing the German Bundestag there. And Richard, we had the opportunity, just as we were having those translation issues, to speak a little bit in between about what we heard there from President Zelenskyy. But towards the end, a real appeal to Germany that he gave there and to Chancellor Scholz himself.
Yeah, it couldn't have been more direct, could it? So this is, as he did in his speech to Congress, picking up on a direct historical reference to events here in Berlin, referring back to Ronald Reagan, the US president's famous speech in the divided Berlin towards the end of the Cold War, when he stood near the Berlin Wall as it still stood and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And then Zelenskyy directly addressing Olaf Scholz, "Let me say to Olaf Scholz, tear down this new wall." So this was a theme that Zelenskyy had in his speech, that there is a new wall in Europe, suggesting that this is a wall that Ukraine is on the wrong side of, that there's essentially the in-group of NATO, and there's Ukraine on the outside, vulnerable to these attacks. From Russia, vulnerable to this war from Russia, and saying to Olaf Scholz directly, show leadership, calling on Germany to show the kind of leadership that I think not just Zelenskyy, but also many other countries on the outside see as befitting Germany, the huge economic power that it is, and that it has, in recent decades, not shown the kind of foreign policy and strategic leadership that some countries are hoping for. And it was interesting to watch Olaf Scholz immediately afterwards, that the camera was on him, and of course him clapping to this message, which was a message to him essentially saying, do more than you've been doing. So that, I think that was a very interesting moment.
What do you think the immediate ask was there of Olaf Scholz and the German government?
Well, I mean, there are various different asks, I think, that we can see coming towards Germany, but also Europe and the West more broadly. Zelenskyy referred to EU membership. So it seems that the Ukrainians have pretty much, this has been the messaging from Zelenskyy recently, they've given up on NATO. They realise it's not going to happen. They have to be realistic about that. And this is even potentially forming the basis of, or part of the negotiations that are ongoing between the Ukrainians and the Russians about a potential end to this war. So giving up on NATO, but Ukraine still wants to join the European Union. Many countries, including Germany, have been very non-committal about that, very hesitant about that, talking about, yes, well, we see Ukraine as part of the European family. We want to support its European aspirations. But this is all very vague. And I think Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians will know that, well, is this the same kind of stringing along that they felt that they had for years from NATO? So I think that's part of the message is, we want to get into the EU. We want you to take that seriously. Other messages include more military support. As we were talking about earlier, they want to see a no-fly zone implemented. That's unlikely to happen, but there could be more military support coming from the Germans, and we just heard Olaf Scholz saying yesterday that he will continue with military support. Sanctions, tougher sanctions. As Zelenskyy said near the beginning of the speech, the sanctions have not stopped the war. What would be next step sanctions? Well, the big kind of area that's been left out from the sanctions in terms of Europe is energy, oil and natural gas. Because of the very high energy prices at the moment, Russia is getting huge payday from the current tensions in the market and from this from their invasion, essentially. It's driven up energy prices, so they're getting a huge amount more money for the same quantities of fossil fuels that they're selling. Now, the German government has been saying so far Germany is in no place to cut off Russian oil and gas, that it needs it too much. But the political pressure for that could mount.
Let's just jump over to Michaela now, our chief political editor, because she was in the plenary there listening to that speech from Volodymyr Zelenskyy and just dashed down now to speak with us again. Michaela, what was your impression? We were just talking here with Richard about the fact that President Zelenskyy was indeed fairly critical of Germany in that speech. What was your impression of how that went down there?
Well, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, all the political hearts are really with him, but quite clearly his criticism is a leadership failure by Olaf Scholz, but also by Germany. And this is also criticism, not least, of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, because he said, look, we warned you that these Nord Stream direct gas pipelines between Russia and Germany, that they are a preparation for war. You kept telling us that this is purely economic. That is also German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who took years to come round to her own recognition that it did have indeed a political aspect to it. Now, once Olaf Scholz took over, which is exactly 100 days ago today, he again started saying this is an economic project, and then came round very late to the fact that indeed it was also political and in fact strategically important. Now he faces the accusation of Germany not taking enough of a leadership role. Clearly, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has moved away from NATO membership, but he insists even more that he needs a European Union prospect, and clearly he placed the expectation here that Germany would back that, which frankly is not going to happen anytime soon. So his historical analysis is this is a new war being built, and the United States, he says, is closer to Ukraine than Germany or Europe.
And Michelle, last question. We were just talking with Richard here about some of the asks that President Zelenskyy is making to Germany and indeed to Europe at this point. And you mentioned, of course, EU membership. You're saying that that doesn't look likely from the German perspective. What about some of these other asks, for example, cutting off Russian oil and gas?
Well, this is a red line that, interestingly, also opponents of the pipeline, the Greens, their ministers don't want to cross at this moment in time, stopping those gas deliveries. There are two very different viewpoints here, and actually it depends on which expert you ask whether Germany is able to do this or not. The politicians say it's not possible right now, certainly the government. And this is something that Volodymyr Zelenskyy clearly sees as a price for freedom that needs to be paid, and it needs to be paid fast. There's a question mark how much of this would be symbolism and how much would be a direct effect. Really, is it that much money that the war would stop? That also appears unlikely, given the situation Vladimir Putin is in, who needs an instant win. And that's also the counter-argument by the German government. So the accusation we've heard by Volodymyr Zelenskyy are not unexpected by the German government, and it's also willing to take any criticism right now, because the line really here and the understanding is this is about the very survival of a state. So there's a lot of support, the German government insists, and as we heard from the German foreign minister implicitly in the speech yesterday, there seems to be a lot more going on than the government is openly talking about. About this we can only speculate, but clearly from where the Ukrainian president stands, it's simply not enough.
Okay, a strong speech from the Ukrainian president in the Bundestag. Michaela Kufner for us there, and Richard Walker with us here in studio. Thanks both for your analysis. Let's get an update on the situation on the ground in Ukraine now. Ukraine is accusing Russia of attacking a theater that was being used as a bomb shelter in the besieged port city of Mariupol. Ukrainian officials say more than 1,000 civilians were in the theater when it was hit. Satellite images taken by a private U.S. company show the word children written on the ground in large white letters on both sides of the building. Russia denies carrying out the attack and says it does not target civilians.